Dr. Danny Harvey. He's a professor in the geography department at University of Toronto. He's working currently on energy in buildings, using green energy, integration of renewable energy into buildings. Much of his previous research was spent uh, looking into climate and the carbon cycle, and he's done a number of computer modeling, and he was lead author on the IPCC technical report that was part of the second IPCC report. So he conducted some of the computer modeling that went into that. He's a scientist. He's aware of what's going on south of us. He knows of the things like the NOAA that has been, which is the let's see, it's the national. No, it's not national
Noah.
atmospheric. The which
You're talking about Noah.
NOAA, yeah,
Yeah,
NOAA, yeah,
National
National
Oceanographic and
Oceanic
Atmospheric
and Atmospheric.
Administration.
Yeah. So Trump has basically taken that apart. There are all kinds of scientists that would have been working on climate change issues. Many of them have lost their job. Science has been discredited by the current president of the United States. And Danny's going to give us a hopeful message with a bit of an introduction, talking about the problems that we're facing due to the current U.S. administration and other things. So Danny, why don't you share your screen and take it away?
Okay, well, first, let me just thank everybody for joining in, and thanks to Jim for inviting me to speak to everybody. And I must admit, it's certainly possible to be completely pessimistic and completely despondent about what's happening in the world, not just on from an environmental point of view, but from the point of view of the attacks on science, the attacks on democracy, liberal democracy, the wars going on, the incredible suffering. I mean, the list is just so long. And also, we are seeing before our eyes now very clear, ominous warning signs from nature, with extreme fires, extreme heat, flooding, hurricanes, you name it. And if that's not bad enough, you would think with that happening, people would finally start getting it. But what we're seeing is actually a retrenchment, of falling back away from action just as it becomes more obvious than ever. And, I think there's a political process happening here. And so you can certainly imagine a very dismal and dystopian world. And also, the climate science may very well be indicating that the climate responsiveness or sensitivity to greenhouse gas heating is on the high end rather than the low end of the estimates. And so, I mean, it could be very dismal. But on the other hand, it might not be. There are still some reasons, in some ways out where it may still work out well with minimal damage. So I'm not, I don't by any means mean to downplay the negative things or the risks. There are very real risks, but what I want to do, and all I'm going to talk about today, is just some reasons for hoping that, I draw the analogy to hockey. It's game 7, Stanley Cup final, 2 minutes left. You're behind 1 or 2 goals. You are the better team, but you've screwed up until now, but you're going to put your best players on the ice. And, there's a chance you'll tie it up, right? And there's a chance you'll send it into overtime and win that game. So I guess I'm going to be talking about how we might be able to, reasons for thinking we might still be able to tie the game up, send it into overtime, and win it. Okay? Even though the odds are against us, I mean, how often do you do that? How often does a team do that? Maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 5, but you always hope, right? You always pull your goalie, you don't give up, and often you do get rewarded. Your team does tie it up. And I remember, I think in the one of those Olympic games, I think it was the women's hockey, couple Olympics back. We were behind the women's Canadian women's hockey team. You remember that was behind 2 goals with 3 minutes left. And it was Poulin, I think, scored one of the goals and then another goal, someone else, and then she got the overtime winner. So that was really remarkable. I had just about given up on the team, which was a mistake because they tied it up. And I think also the that game where Sidney Crosby won it in overtime. We were behind, right? I'm not sure if we pulled our goalie or not, but anyway, it happens. So anyway, there's a little hockey history there. It happens. Okay, so now let's see if I can share. Okay, so do you see my slides? Okay, so now what I need to do is okay,
Make your screen big and then go to slideshow and do slideshow. And you've muted yourself, Danny.
I don't know how I did that. Okay, I'm unmuted now, right? Okay, so I'm going to do
F5
slide.
usually works, Danny.
Okay, there we go from the current slides. Okay, so now I have this little bar in the way, but okay, so 7 reasons for optimism about the future, at least as far as global warming, climate change is concerned. Okay, so let me see now. My first reason is there actually has been a noticeable slowing down in the rate of growth of fossil fuel emissions, and we seem to be approaching an imminent peaking in the rate of fossil fuel emissions. And so, that's the first step is stabilize emissions, right? Then we worry about stabilizing the CO2 concentration, later on stabilizing the climate, and much later stabilizing sea level. But the first step is to stabilize the emissions. So now I'm showing you a slide from the International Energy Agency. By the way, they are one of the strongest uh, climate activist organizations in the world. So I would recommend checking out the IEA periodically for their various outlook reports. They had like outlook on EVs, outlook on heat pumps. They have oil market reports, wind market reports, and they have their world energy outlooks. And so this is from the 2022 edition. And they did a calculation of where they thought emissions were heading, basically continuing straight up, straight line prior to the 2015 Paris Agreement. And this is where they are projecting emissions to be going based on what they call their steps, which are policies already in place. And the point I'm highlighting here in yellow is this scenario has emissions peaking right about now and actually slightly on the way down by 2030. So this is the first time we're seeing a conventional scenario from a cautious group, the International Energy Agency, predicting an imminent peaking in emissions, which means an imminent peaking in combined fossil fuel use. And the other interesting thing is this bar here is their projection based on IPCC stuff of where we were heading pre-Paris with a end of century temperature range of about 3 to 5 degrees above pre-industrial. And now that's been reduced to 2 to 3.5. Still too much, but it's a big improvement. And then APS is where they project we would be going emission-wise and temperature projections if pledges and policies governments have already announced but have not yet implemented were to be put in place. Now, that may have included some of the Biden era announcements, which maybe won't be followed through. But anyway, it's, going to be somewhere in this range. Okay, so that's their projection. Now, of course, the oil exporting countries and the oil companies are saying, "Oh, don't believe any of this. We're oil use will continue growing for decades, and we need all these pipelines, et cetera, et cetera." And you might think, yeah, really, is there any basis for believing these IEA projections? Because this is the trend line in fossil fuel emissions, and it seems to be just a continuous straight line up. But actually, if you look at it more closely, there has been a noticeable slowing down. The rate of growth from 2010 to 20 or 25 was about half that of 2000 to 2010. And if you look further at individual fuels, coal, okay, so this is up to 2023, the last year that we actually have data. So, okay, coal use has almost plateaued. Oil use actually seems it hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic. Natural gas use seems to have plateaued, and cement and oil flaring has actually plateaued or slightly downward. So when you look at that, then if you go further and look at the if you look at the IEA oil market update from September 2024, they lay out the case that oil demand is going to peak in the next couple of years. And the case consists of the following. Almost 100% of the growth in oil demand has been due to increasing demand in China. It's actually been falling in much of the West. That has sort of offset slight increases in other developing countries, but the net increase has been due to Chinese growth. And Chinese growth in oil demand is about to end because of the growth in EVs. EVs are now 50% of new car sales in China. The growth in high-speed rail, I mean, they're building tens of thousands or at least thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail. And they're also building thousands of kilometers of high-voltage DC transmission lines. And then there's been the collapse in the real estate market and in building construction, which was fueling a lot of the oil growth. So, and by the way, if oil demand peaks, then prices will fall. There aren't going to be new markets. So I think already there was a very little case for new pipelines in Canada. There's no business case for it, except possibly a pipeline. And this is all I've actually heard Carney refer to. I've never heard him say, we're going to build pipelines to increase exports. The most I've heard him say is a pipeline possibly to displace imports, okay, to make Eastern Canada more independent. But of course, everybody thinks he promised new pipelines for exports. But if you read carefully, he's actually been very coy in what he said. And there is no economic case for pipelines to increase exports. And it's because there's a lot of credibility in this IEA projection. So anyway, this is part of my broader first reason, which was, fossil fuel demand, fossil fuel emissions, and oil demand are about to peak and are about to begin a long-term decline. And so that's good news. And that is really the first time we can see that based on actual projections rather than, hypothetical scenarios, projections based on actual supply and demand. Okay, so my second reason for optimism stems from looking at the recent data series for beef and dairy consumption. So as you undoubtedly all know, or most of you know, apart from carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, another big anthropogenic source of greenhouse gas emissions is methane and to a lesser extent, nitrous oxide from animal agriculture. And the two biggest offenders are beef and dairy cattle. Um, and so what I have here is this graph here, the dots, this is absolute global beef consumption from 1960 to 2023. So it fell, I think, because there was less income and per capita income, so people were cutting back on expensive foods. It fell during the pandemic. It hasn't recovered yet. So it remains to be seen what will happen. But at any rate, there has been a long-term decline in per capita beef consumption. And remember, beef consumption is also one of the major drivers of tropical deforestation. So apart from being a direct source of methane and from the manure and nitrous oxide emissions, it's also a driver of deforestation, which is a source of CO2 emissions. So, it's gone from what, 10, 11 kilograms to a little less than 9 kilograms per person per year on average. So it would be good if we can accelerate that decline. And of course, the health case among all of the animal food products that you would be best to get rid of from a health point of view, red meat and beef is pretty much at the top of the list. So there's a climate and health match there. Now, when it comes to the other major animal source of greenhouse gas emissions, dairy cattle, there's been some strange trends here. And I haven't had it, I just plotted this up today and I was surprised by this. But this could be possibly a collapse of demand in Eastern Europe and Russia, and then a resumption of growth through increasing demand in China. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's sort of back to where it was in absolute terms in the 1960s. And, there's been a bit of a dip here, but it remains to be seen what's actually happening. So, but anyway, there is also a very strong case for not drinking milk, because after all, milk is designed to promote the rate of growth of a calf, which is 50 times the rate of growth of a human infant. And you should expect that priori, that if you're, consuming something that stimulatory your entire adult life, you might have problems with prostate cancer in the case of guys, or cervical or breast cancer in the case of women. And certainly that is the case. Statistically, that holds out. So there's a strong case. And a lot of people are recognizing that now with the growth of dairy alternatives. So there's no real clear trend, I would say, right now, but there is increasing awareness. And certainly now in most parts of the world, including I was in East Africa last summer, it's pretty easy now, at least where I've been, to get dairy alternatives. Okay, so there's some reason, I think, for guarded optimism concerning the trends for two of these other major sources of greenhouse gases. Okay, another reason I'm optimistic is I'm not worried about the Malthusian population scenario anymore. I remember going to Mexico City in the mid to late 1980s. When the fertility rate in Mexico was something like 4 or 5. And I was thinking, you know what? The most important U.S. foreign policy goal should be to help Mexico reduce its birth rate. Well, guess what? The birth rate in Mexico, barely 20 years later, is now around about the replacement level. And in fact, 70% of the world's population now lives in countries that are at or below or very close to the replacement level fertility. This is a dramatic improvement in the last 20 to 30 years. And I think this is good news in two ways. Um, it it means, first of all, there'll be it's it's reducing one of the drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, all else being equal, and I mean, I would like to see a world where everybody has a decent standard of living. That requires energy and food and land. So I'd like, I'm happier to see a smaller population of well-off people than a large population of well-off people, or even a large population of not so well-off people. So I think in terms of one of the drivers of emissions, this is good news. But also when you look at the impact, if in the future when there are negative impacts on water and food, if we have to find, it'll be easier to find a way to feed 8 billion people than it will be to feed 10 billion or 12 billion. So that means fewer people hungry and fewer people dying in the future. And so that's good news too. So at both ends, both so the driving force and the impacts, falling fertility rates are good. Now you see Africa here is at 4, but even like 20 years ago that was 6. And in parts of Africa, the fertility rate is falling. I think I just mentioned I was in East Africa last summer. I visited Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania for 6 weeks. And I was, well, those countries, especially Kenya, Tanzania, they're really booming economically. And that brings around that brings about the desire for lower family sizes, uh, and all the other incentives. So I think there's a good chance that significant parts of Africa are going to see falling fertility rates as well. So to me, this is good news. And now a lot of people worry now about declining population rates. I'm just not worried about that. I mean, I think, with the growth in productivity, with machines doing most of everything we need now, I don't think, as long as we can produce the essentials of life for the entire population, I don't think falling, as long as it's not too fast. Maybe in China they need to be concerned. Okay, well, actually, as an aside, the fertility rate in Korea is 0.73. I think they do need to be concerned about the population falling a little too fast. But again, just as an aside, I noticed a lot of, and I was talking to a Korean national who works for UNEP. I mean, Korea has now like Korean as a second language schools in Kenya. They want, this is like, there's an excess of people in Africa. They're starting to seriously consider the need for immigration and immigration from Africa. So actually Korea is trying to increase its links with Kenya, right? So because yeah, they're at a really dangerous situation when it comes to their fertility rate. And Japan is like zero point 0.9 too. So anyway, that's as an aside. Um, okay, then now my fourth reason is there's been a truly dramatic tightening in the energy provisions of building codes around the world. Now, of course, this is the energy requirement if the building is actually built to code. And we know in practice that developers and the trades, they take shortcuts, and often it's not built the way it's supposed to be, or it's not operated the way it's supposed to be. So in practice, a lot of buildings are using more energy than they're designed to use. But that was true in the past as well. So, but the point is the envelope or the target, this is like an attractor, right? It's going down. So what I'm showing, and so let me just, as an aside, as Jim mentioned, I started my career in the climate and carbon cycling business in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And I was really wondering, are we screwed? Is there any hope? Is there any way out? So, and I was getting to know architects and engineers and learning little bits here and there about buildings. And I decided, you know what, I need to take a closer look at this myself. And so I looked into the building area and discovered that most of what we're building, and this is around the year 2000, 2005, is really garbage from an energy efficiency point of view. And I realized that from what I read of analyses that had been done, that, you know what, we could actually build buildings that use one quarter the energy of the existing building stock, let's say circa the year 2000. So anyway, that would be, this is what was in existence around, where's my cursor? Here it is. So what I'm showing you here is there's a commercial building code called ASHRAE 90.1, American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And it has members from countries all around the world. And so they develop these model energy codes, building codes, specifications. And then that serves as a template for state level codes in various those states in the US that actually have a building code, or for other building codes in other parts of the world. And so then they basically have been revising their building code now recently every 3 years. So the next revision, I guess, would come out in 2025, this year. And then the Department of Energy, and I don't know if this group has all been fired recently, but they would then use a standard model to compare. So basically, they had a series of prototype buildings, 12 different prototype buildings, the same building in like 12 different climate zones. So there'd be like altogether over 200 different simulations. And they would run it first with the building, with the provisions for the 2004. And then when it was revised, they would run it for the 2007 and 2010 and so on. So you can see with the same model, the same set of prototype buildings that are meant to be a sample of US buildings and climate, an estimate of what the implications would be on the energy use of new buildings in the US if they were actually built as designed, and everything functioned properly, which means proper follow-up, proper commissioning, and so on, which isn't always done. And the point is, the 2022 version is down now to about 50%. And then recent analyses say there's still room to go 50% lower. So there's that factor of 4 that people were saying back in the early 2000s should be possible. So, in terms of the building code, we're about halfway there. And so there's the other half that has to be mined. Okay, now we have a comparable building code in Canada. It's called the National Energy Code for Buildings, but I haven't been able to find like a time series simulation of the implications of a fixed set of prototype buildings for energy use for the Canadian building code, but it's being tightened as well. But what I can show you is this slide here. So this is from a paper I published 10 years ago, and I guess I should try to update it. But this is, now I'm moving to residential buildings, and this is showing you the energy use for residential buildings in different countries built in different decades. And Canada here is, so like residential buildings built in the 70s in Canada were coming in about 280. And then by the 2010s, we were down to about 80. And there's a standard called the Passive House Standard, which is now pretty close to the norm in Europe. It's like the Toronto Waterfront Generation Trust which is developing a lot of the new housing along the Toronto waterfront, the Portlands, East Bayside, and so on. They've adopted the Passive House standard as the standard. The University of Toronto Scarborough campus has developed the Passive House standard as the standard. And the City of Toronto is supposed to be there for all buildings in Toronto by 2030. Now, the province is trying to gum that up, and this is something we need to fight. But I mean, this is like a factor of 10 or 20 reduction. So that's pretty big. And this slide here, this is comparing the energy use of a typical Ottawa suburb house built in the 70s compared to the latest version. This is the net zero energy house, the energy requirement. You would then put solar panels on to offset this energy use to get ideally net zero. But what we have here is the heating requirement of this latest version compared to the 1970s house. And you can see it is a factor of 10 reduction. So now the problem is this is not what's required yet by law. And you can short circuit it. It actually requires pride in your work, right? Attention to details, doing things properly. Because when the energy use is going to be this low, little mistakes can spoil it. So it really takes high quality, but then that has all sorts of other co-benefits. So anyway, here's some ground for optimism. This is a factor of 10 reduction. On the heating side, it's even better than where we're hopefully aiming on the commercial side. Of course, commercial buildings are a lot larger and more complicated, and part of that is plug load. Now, on the negative side, the growth of artificial intelligence is projected to mushroom and suck up huge amounts of electricity. But then on the other side, again, this new company that you heard about in China that developed some AI, I forget what it's called, that apparently does the same thing with 1/10 the energy. So there may be still huge potentials, and quantum computing is supposed to, provide another quantum leap or quantum reduction in our energy requirements for a given amount of computing. Of course, the problem is then we just find new ways to use up that energy. So at any rate, we're going to have to rein in one way or the other. I mean, I don't think all these search engine things should be free. If you had to pay even a nominal amount for the search engine results, that might dampen demand. Anyway, there's a mix of positive and negative things for sure, but it's not all bad, and there's a lot of positive things. Okay, my fifth reason, let me see if I have some water here. I do. There's been a breathtaking decrease in the price of wind and solar from 80 cents a kilowatt hour in Toronto, Canada, and in much of Canada to like 5 cents in places in Canada, and 3 cents, even less than 3 cents in sunny desert climes. And this has driven a really rapid growth in wind and solar energy supply. And so what I did here was I compiled data on generating capacity, which is measured in gigawatts, or where are we? Yeah, here it is, gigawatts, or billions of watts. And I've added up fossil plus nuclear, because even though nuclear is carbon free, I don't see it as having a significant future because it's expensive. And so it, like fossil, may eventually need to be replaced. So I'm comparing hydro capacity plus wind plus solar. And, the hydro, wind, and solar capacities, the data are more up to date because you can get them from, wind energy associations and solar energy associations, which are trying to promote their industry. Whereas the fossil and nuclear, you have to wait till the official data become available. So there's a couple of years lag. But anyway, what you can see is fossil plus nuclear globally stands at about 5,000 gigawatts or 5 terawatts. But look at hydro, wind, and solar is 80% of that already, right? And it's gone from down here, this was almost entirely hydro. There's been some increase in hydro, but it's mostly wind and solar going from basically zero in 2001 to contributing to this 80% now. Okay. Now, of course, the wind and solar are not generating electricity all of the time, and at times it's zero, whereas fossil plus nuclear are running at 60, 70% of their peak capacity on average. So they're going to churn out more kilowatt hours than a given capacity of wind and solar. So when you look at it in terms of the actual generation of electricity, it stands at 40%. But I think that's larger than I would have expected. And that is not trivial. This is a significant development. Wind plus hydro plus solar are now generating 40% as much electricity as fossil plus nuclear worldwide. So that's quite an accomplishment. And the fossil plus nuclear have pretty much plateaued, or are inching up only slowly, whereas this is going up at an accelerating rate. And for now, it's largely driven by growth in China and secondarily by growth in Europe, and also some other major Asian countries are stepping up. India, Japan with offshore, South Korea, Taiwan. So at the moment, of course, we've been, if anything, opposing or blocking wind and solar. Danielle Smith in Alberta, Doug Ford in Ontario. So, we're on pause for some reason right now. But hopefully that will change soon. And then that's, something we need to fight for, is to get wind and solar back on track here in Canada. Okay, now my sixth reason for optimism, guarded optimism. And I appreciate, Jim, very much what you said during your land acknowledgement. It's the best land acknowledgement I've actually seen. And especially what you were saying about the Ring of Fire. I didn't realize it was quite that far north. And yes, it's not going to develop as fast as the politicians would like. I mean, it's a minimum 10-year development. Now, right now, the federal government policy is no sales of internal combustion engine gasoline powered vehicles from 2035 onward. We're supposed to reach 100% EV sales by 2035. I think that mandate is going to be relaxed. I don't think it's possible to achieve it in that time frame, because even if you had all the permits right now, it would take 10 years minimum to get any mine going. And that's already 2035. So, but anyway, if you look at the data so far, EV sales are off to what I would call a solid start. And now we've heard of companies like Stellantis and Honda recently postponing some of their battery developments. And there's talk of EV sales or sales growth slowing down. But I looked at quarterly sales data, which are available. Well, okay, well, first of all, pardon me, before I go into Canadian data, here are the global data. Okay. And so I guess so this is global sales of EVs up to last year, 17 million sold last year. And then the orange part is the sale of gasoline powered vehicles on top of that. So the sum of those two is giving you total annual sales of passenger cars. And you see it peaked in 2017. So for me, this is good news. If we're producing and selling less cars, that's good news. And it's even better news if we're producing and selling less gasoline powered cars. So I've shown you here that this is the actual sale of gasoline cars. So, it's considerably below. It's like 50 million, less, just under 50 million a year. It peaked at 70 million. So for me, this is good news. This is another reason why oil demand is projected to peak, right? One of the major demands for oil, passenger cars, is declining. And it's been industrial demand for oil in China, which has been the major contributor to the Chinese growth in demand in oil, which in turn has been the major contributor to the global oil demand. So again, this is why the IEA is projecting oil demand to peak very soon. Anyway, this is good news for me, especially this green curve here. Now, I have a lot of misgivings about the sustainability of this and whether or not we're increasing it too fast. In fact, I published a number of papers questioning whether we should be going so fast on EVs. And okay, so let me go back. Let me get to the point. Okay, so okay, what I did here was I plotted quarterly data from Statistics Canada, right? So I have like fine temporal resolution, right? And so this is so Statistics Canada, if you go to this website, you'll get data on quarterly registrations, meaning new car sales of electric vehicles. And then I looked at cumulative because if something is growing exponentially and then eventually is going to saturate, it's not exponential growth forever. It turns into what's called a logistic function. And there's a certain beautiful shape shown in a cumulative curve if it fits a logistic function. So I wanted to see if there was any evidence of EV sales already beginning to plateau. And what you can see is I get an equal, whether it's a pure exponential curve, it's kind of linear from 2016 to 2020, but it's pretty much just a pure exponential growth from 2020 to the last quarter of 2024. So at least in the data that I can see from Statistics Canada, it's not yet showing any sign of a slowdown in the growth of EV sales. But again, I can't imagine it continuing until we reach 100% of the market in 2035. I think something will give between now and then. So anyway, what I want to show you are the data. Again, now these are the annual data from that same Statistics Canada website. And you can see the Statistics Canada data are pretty fine grained. So what I have in the blue or various shades of green, so this is everything up to here. These are pure electric vehicles subdivided into pickup trucks, vans, multi-purpose vehicle, and cars. And then the red are various forms of plug-in hybrids. And I like the plug-in hybrids because the battery sizes and the mineral requirements are a lot smaller, and they don't require anywhere near the government subsidy. And if I were to buy one, I would want to buy one of these, not an EV, because I would want to use it to go canoeing up to Algonquin and back. So I just think this, excuse me, is a more practical interim purchase. But what I like also are hybrid electric vehicles. These are purely gasoline powered, but they have a motor. When you're not needing peak power, which is most of the time, your engine is recharging a battery. And then when you accelerate or climb hills, you get some of your power off the battery, which means you can have a smaller internal combustion engine. And so the bottom line is an HEV uses about half the gasoline as a comparable conventional vehicle. So anyway, I'm actually working with a group of people right now who are going to prepare some proposals to present to Mark Carney's advisors on. I mean, we think the government should back off on this EV mandate and replace it with an EV plus HEV mandate, but require a tightening of the fuel efficiency standards such that they can only be met by HEVs and efficient HEVs and downsized HEVs. So I don't like pickup trucks, unless, you're a carpenter and you need it. But otherwise, so what we want to see is a fuel efficiency standard that can only be met by modest size HEVs, and allow that along with HEVs to give us time to do the proper consultation if we are going to develop the Ring of Fire. And also, I'd rather see small electric vehicles rather than pickup trucks, so that the mining requirements are smaller. Everything we require is smaller, because many people have shown that if you try to electrify everything the way we're doing, it's just not sustainable. We're not going to get there. So, but anyway, I think electric vehicles are going to be the way to go. But I think they should be small electric vehicles, and they should be in the context of a strong emphasis on compact urban form and transit and cycling and walking as alternatives and more car sharing. So, the good news is, there's every reason for EVs to end up being cheaper than conventional vehicles. And in fact, in China, they already are. The BYD cars, according to one of my Chinese colleagues, they're already cheaper than conventional vehicles in China. And that's now why half of the new car sales in China are electric vehicles. And they tend to be smaller, right? So, in a country with 1.4 billion people, you don't have room for these monster cars. So anyway, I see, lots of angles that we can pursue, that might lead to a sustainable future. And so we need to push on those angles, just like there's different ways we can score a goal. Okay, to go into overtime. Okay, now let's see, where am I? My cursor. I think I had one more reason. Oh, okay, my last slide here, still on EVs. This is showing the sale of these different the market share. And so I was surprised in Canada, we're now at 15% of total vehicle sales as either fully electric or plug-in hybrid. And what I don't think we're adequately promoting and should be promoting are just HEVs. I would just like to see them completely displace conventional vehicles, or displace 80% of them or 70%, leaving room for some but slower growth in the electric vehicles. Okay, so now what's my next slide? Oh, yes, okay. So the last thing that makes me optimistic are the advances in mass timber buildings. And what I would encourage you to do is, okay, so here's a picture of, this is a wood building. This is Brock Commons. I think it's 20, okay, 18 floors, wood building, except it has a concrete elevator shaft. But since then, they built wood buildings that don't even have concrete elevator shafts, right? And they're going higher now than 18 stories. And I actually have, I guess when we make this slide pack available, there's some pretty neat videos here on what you can do with mass timber, like prefabricated, factory built components that are assembled on site, made of cross-laminated timber or something called glulam. And I was actually quite happy to see, what's his name, Gregor, the former mayor of Vancouver. What was his name? Gregor something.
Gregor Robertson.
Yeah, mayor. So he's Minister of Housing. And I just read all this whining about him in the Globe and Mail, because he was mayor of Vancouver when the price of housing doubled. Well, okay, fine. What a simple-minded correlation that would be if you draw any conclusion from that. But anyway, he was also mayor of Vancouver when they built several of the world's first mass timber high-rise buildings. And I'm very impressed with Mark Carney's pre-election strategy on housing, which was, let's kickstart a prefabricated modular a mass timber building construction industry in Canada. That is the way to go. First of all, we need to create a new market for all of our beautiful wood that the Americans don't want. So secondly, we need, when you think about the changes in mass social media, iPhones, and so on, and computers in just the last 10 years, not to mention the last 20, compare that with the construction industry and housing construction. It needs to change. And we're facing a shortage of labor, skilled workers. So, we need a new way of doing things where one worker can do what used to require 10. That gets costs down. That gets the volume of buildings you can produce up. So prefabricated, factory built, mass timber components is the way to do that. And you also have quality control. You can build these components such that when they're assembled, the building meets the Passive House standard. You can build solar PV modules or hot water modules built in. This, is solving three problems at once. So I'm guardedly optimistic. It's interesting. Mark Carney is a central banker. He's worked for Goldman Sachs, but he definitely has a leftist, even socialist bend to him. If you read his book Values, to me, it's all very balanced and makes perfect sense. By the way, if you read his book Values, what I noticed is he quotes both Marx and Adam Smith almost equally. But let's not tell everybody that. But anyway, the point is he sees a proactive role for government, and they use that very effectively in South Korea and in Japan and in China. And so, as long as decisions are made on the basis of hard, cold economic analysis, that can be successful. So let's hope we proceed that way. And of course, we have to be vigilant and we have to hold the government to task. But I'm kind of optimistic about the possibilities here and solving three problems in one. So those are my 7 reasons for being somewhat optimistic, although it's also a dangerous time. And, we have to be active on many fronts. Um, but the other thing I would say is it seems the way to avoid the ascent of sort of right-wing, illiberal, populist parties is to address the housing problem. Because if young people feel like there's no future, no hope of, I mean, the cost of housing, rent, that's turning people against mainstream parties. So, and these reactionary parties are not interested in addressing the climate problem. So, actually, in the long run, to address the climate problem, apart from being able to have higher quality buildings, I think we need to address the housing problem so that we avoid these reactionary, populist right-wing parties from coming to power. Okay, so those are my thoughts. Hopefully that conveys a little optimism. Now I'd be quite happy to hear your critique, your comments uh, of what I said, and I hope I haven't spoken for too long.
Yeah, I think Danny, we've got plenty of time still for some questions and answers, hopefully. And if you could, oh, that's perfect. Okay, we're all
Right.
set. So if people have questions, if you would please use the function in the React portion to raise your hand, and then you'll be called on. You can unmute, or if you'd rather, you could put a question in the chat and we'll read it out and get Danny's perspective on that. So the floor is open for questions.
I think we're all kind of stunned with all of the data and everything that's been presented. It was an interesting presentation, and when we doom scroll down the climate sections of the various mass media organizations, we get hit with constantly with all of the reasons why there's not much hope, why we're going to go up to 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees, the Arctic ice mass, the Antarctic ice mass is going to disappear. The permafrost is going to release vast quantities of methane, and yet when I hear your presentation, it all sounds very logical, and it does give some reasons for hope. So, that there's a real tension here between the two extremes.
Yeah, well, first of all, 3 degrees is a very plausible scenario. And, we may very well end up at that or even more. I mean, it just depends on how much longer the nations of the world are going to drag their feet. I mean, if we lose another decade, um, if emissions resume their upward climb or continue their upward climb, then I think 3 degrees is the most likely scenario, and we might even be lucky at that. But so we certainly have to fight and struggle and hold government push as hard as we can. I think we're certainly going to go over 1.5. And we're probably going to overshoot 2 degrees. I mean, really, I think the most optimistic scenario, it would be I think, very optimistic to plateau at 2 degrees, but I think 2 degrees is still possible. And then maybe gradually draw things down. And then the question is, at 2 degrees, do you trigger the beginning of an irreversible collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet or of the Greenland ice sheet? Maybe we will, maybe we won't. And then even if we trigger it, it could be spread out over 1,000 years, which is pretty bad. I mean, it could be 5 meters sea level rise over 1,000 years, or 10 meters over 1,000 years, which is still pretty bad. So, as I said, when you're behind a goal with a minute left, you're probably going to lose the game, but you certainly don't give up. So I think, we have to be realistic. The odds are somewhat against us, but if we don't try, then we're all doomed, right? So we have to give it the best shot we can still. And then, of course, and we have to do our best in Canada, right? We especially have to hold our own government to account, and, preserve as much as we can in Canada and make things as fair as we can in Canada in the way we deal with Indigenous peoples and properly accommodating new immigrants. And we've been doing a lousy job on that recently. So we just have to try to be the best example and just do things the best way we can. And yeah, try to proceed in a logical, compassionate way in Canada. And if the rest of the world goes down the tubes, well, we've done the best we can, right?
Yep, I think that's a good answer. I see Don has his hand up, and then we have some other questions that are in the chat. Don, go ahead.
Thanks very much to Dr. Harvey. That is a really fascinating presentation. I have a couple of questions that maybe other things that you might add to your optimism list. One is, has somebody looked at, and do we have a sense of what the energy change is as the temperature goes up? So I know that the heating bills in the home that I live in are going down because it's a warmer winter. Of course, that's offset to some extent by increased expenditures for air conditioning. But this number must have some impact, and maybe it's one of the things that we can look optimistically. And the second question, which is a different question, but is tied to what's going on with the United States at this point. We have, to a large extent, been following the Americans in the way that which we've dealt in Canada with fossil fuel emissions. We're big emitters, we're big exporters, and now we suddenly discover that being friends of the Americans may not be an option, or be certainly not nearly as an attractive option as it once was. And we now have to become friends with the Europeans and some parts of the global South and so on, where there's a much more rational and appropriate way to approach the climate crisis. Are those factors that you should be adding to your list?
Reasons for optimism? Well, okay, just a comment on of course, cooling requirements will go up as it gets warmer. So it's another reason why we should be building buildings to be passively cooled as much as possible. Like design the buildings to avoid heat gain in the first place. So like avoid hermetically sealed, all glass walls facing facing west, the afternoon sun, allow for shading, natural ventilation, thermal mass, night cooling, and so on, so that even under the present climate, we're reducing the cooling requirements, and even more so as it gets warmer. So we certainly, have to be preemptive in terms of not locking in yet greater increases in cooling demand in the future. Now, in terms of aligning with the U.S., we can push our own building code standards, and we're doing that. And now, if Donald Trump wants to dismantle the integrated North American automobile market, then actually this provides an opportunity for Canada to pursue its own standards, because we have been aligning automobile fuel economy standards with the US out of necessity, because it's an integrated market. If that's going to be decoupled, and this is the point, the group I'm working with. I don't know if we're actually going to meet with Carney. I didn't mean to apply that, but we want to certainly pass on something to his advisors. This is an opportunity for Canada to pursue an independent path with regard to automobile efficiency standards. So we can do that. And of course, building an east-west electricity grid to link together high quality wind, solar, and hydro resources. And like hydro reservoirs can serve as a giant battery, right, for wind and solar. So we need to do that. And so if the Americans don't want our electricity, then Quebec's hydropower. I mean, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance has pointed out that the small modular reactors that the Ford government seems intent to go away with, it's going to create a dependence on American enriched uranium. Like CANDU reactors use natural uranium and they use deuterium, which we produce here in Canada. And now they want to create a new generation of nuclear that actually depends on American supply of the fuel. And of course, the other thing is in Ontario, the natural gas that we use actually comes from the US. It doesn't come from Western Canada. So, the two main arguments or efforts of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance are, let's basically use Quebec hydro to avoid the need for new nuclear, which would be dependent on US fuel supplies, and to avoid the need for new natural gas, which would be dependent on American natural gas. So, it just makes eminent sense. But getting that through to the Ford government, wow. So anyway, I would recommend, lending support to the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And I think, Jim, your group in Hamilton was opposing some natural gas, some things involving Enbridge and new hookups for natural gas. There's a third area, right? We should be all new residential buildings should be built to use heat pumps, not natural gas. So there's three big areas right there that would decouple us or avoid further dependence on the United States.
Right. Very good. So Lucia asks, do you see different amounts of optimism or pessimism in your academic colleagues based on age or region of the world, etc.? Do you see different patterns?
Well, I haven't really surveyed that myself. But there's a lot of literature on climate, ecological grief and climate grief. And even among, especially biologists, studying, you're a biologist, right, Jim? Imagine, there's such, nature is just so, and life and the diversity and complexity of life is just so amazing. And it is truly heartbreaking to lose that. Just through habitat destruction, even apart from climatic changes, what we're losing, what we're destroying, the outcome of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. So, but yeah, so I think those who are in the thick of things are probably experiencing it more because they have a greater appreciation of what we're losing.
And with our government that we have right now in Ontario, it's all about the money. So we are losing on several fronts. Now, I've got a question here that's a practical one, I think. What would you say are the main areas that people should be pushing the Canadian government to improve in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? What can we do? How can we push them?
Well, okay, so I would like to see a revamping of the automobile fuel efficiency standards because right now there's separate standards for cars and separate standards for pickup trucks that are used as cars. And so and what's happening is there's a shift in the market from passenger cars to pickup trucks. And even though the energy use of both have gone down, when you're switching from one to the other, you're nullifying about half of the savings you would get otherwise. And then within the car segment, the bigger the car, the more lax the standard. So I would like to see a fleet average standard that applies to the overall mix, right? So that means you can't just shift entirely it has to be, a stringent enough standard that you can realistically meet it only if you're selling, mostly mid-size hybrid electric vehicles, rather than, big size conventional vehicles. So yeah, fuel efficiency standards. And then, as I said, we're doing pretty well with the building code. I think really what I haven't mentioned is retrofits of existing buildings. The government does have a program to subsidize heat pumps. So this is a tricky policy, because ideally, if you have a poorly insulated leaky house with a large heating load, right? The heating load is the amount of heat that you're losing. That amount of heat needs to be replaced. So you can have a large load and then generate that heat efficiently with a heat pump, but you're doing a lot of work. If you insulate and improve the windows first, get the load down, and you could get that, like the data I was showing you before, those were heating loads for those Ottawa houses. You downsize the load, that could go down a factor of 5 to 10, and then you could meet that reduced load 3 or 4 times more efficiently. But the problem is it's very expensive to downsize the load. To do a complete envelope retrofit, and it's cheaper and quicker to just put in the heat pump. But if you're putting in the heat pump to meet this leaky house, then there's a larger demand on the electricity grid. And then if later you insulate, now you've got an oversized heat pump, right? So I think a solution that has been proposed is, under the current rules, to get the subsidy for the heat pump, you got to get rid of your furnace. But maybe you keep your furnace, right? And size the heat pump to provide the full heating load down to, say, -10 instead of -20, right? And then use your furnace as the backup or the supplement on those really cold days, because otherwise you're reverting to electric resistance heating. And if everybody's doing that all at once, it's a big strain on the grid. So you do kind of like a hybrid. It's kind of like hybrid electric vehicles, right? It's like a hybrid heating system. And then later, when you retrofit your house and put in all the great windows, you can get rid of your furnace, because now you've reduced your load so the heat pump can handle it on the coldest days and you don't need that furnace. So it allows you to delay the expensive envelope and window replacement until you actually need to replace the windows, because otherwise it's prohibitively expensive. But anyway, the current rules don't allow for that. So I think, promoting a policy, and again, just like I have grave doubts about us being able to actually meet the 2035 mandate on EVs, I'm really doubtful that, if you replace all the heating in Toronto with heat pumps without reducing the loads, would the grid handle it? I doubt it. Okay. So again, I think we're going to have to do it in stages, but in a way that, will get us there rather than causing a collapse of the system, right? it will actually get us there and still give us significant reductions along the way. So, but I think there are groups, actually, yeah, I think it was the Pembina Institute or Clean Energy Canada. I came across somewhere proposal along these lines, and I think that's a really good idea. So I think we need to do more, there's room for some rethinking of the policies with regard to promoting retrofits. And then, of course, federal support for an east-west transmission line is pretty important, and maybe for storage and just getting the provinces talking to each other, right? Like that's so important.
I have another one here. It says, I don't think you actually meant to say this. You talk about presenting to Mark Carney in an optimistic tone. Have you also presented your findings and suggestions to the Ontario government? And if so, what kind of resistance or deafness are you experiencing?
No, I haven't been involved with the Ontario government at all, except to sign the petitions opposing the removal of bike lanes, which for me is a pretty big issue. But no, I'm just involved in this group because we see an opportunity now to maybe get the government. Well, we see the eventual necessity of changing the EV mandate, and an opportunity now to actually improve the regulations regarding automobiles, which is federal jurisdiction.
I'm gonna really summarize this one long comment that ends in the sentence. I actually have a question. Can regular gas cars be converted to HEVs?
Well, what do you mean by converted? I think if it's built the way it is, it stays that way. But I mean, you can build, they are building HEVs comparable to the various types of conventional vehicles that exist.
Next question. Have you presented to any home builders associations? Because some of what you're saying might convince some of these folks, which would be very helpful.
Well, I myself have not, but I know some of my colleagues. But yeah, I should, truth is, I have been having a running discussion with one of my architecture colleagues about the merits of retrofitting first, and then putting in the heat pump versus just putting in the heat pump now. So I should maybe resume that dialogue, and find out who it is that's promoting this hybrid approach, and just connect the two. So yeah, I should follow up on that.
What this question is, I can make it broader, but what do you think Carney and Ford's obsession with more nuclear is when conservation, wind, solar, etc., are so much cheaper? And I guess I would put that in terms of the Ontario Jack
okay,
which looks like, yeah, we need to go green and it's cheaper. So what's the deal?
I'm actually quite mystified by Mark Carney, because first of all, when he was working for Brookfield Asset Management, it was either that or one of the other Brookfield related companies. They actually bought GE. They're a co-owner of GE Hitachi, right? And so that would have been the advice of Mark Carney, because he was advising Brookfield. So they went ahead. So actually, GE Hitachi is partly Canadian owned. And okay, this is what they're saying. So it's the GE Hitachi is now what Ontario government is pursuing. And they're saying, right, the first one they build was supposed to come in at $7,000 a kilowatt capital cost. Wind and solar are like in Canada even are $1,000 a kilowatt. However, wind and solar are only producing electricity, 20% of the time on average. So whereas the small modular reactor is producing electricity almost all the time. So when you work out the cost per kilowatt hour, they're projecting 14 cents. Okay. Whereas wind and solar is 5 or 6, right? So it is 3 times more expensive, which is not necessarily a bad thing for something that runs almost 24/7. Okay. So, I mean, in a resilient, reliable system, you are going to have different components. You're not going to make it all out of the cheapest components, right? You're going to have some expensive components where that extra cost is worth it, or that you can justify that extra cost. So, in a system that has 30,000 megawatts, which is the size of the Ontario system, 3 or 4 small modular reactors, which is like 1,200 megawatts, it's like 3 or 4%. That is more expensive, but is supposedly reliable, right? It's supposed to be able to run all the time, except for routine maintenance. So yeah, if it's reliable and if it truly does come in at 14 cents a kilowatt hour, even though that sounds expensive, I can see you can make a case for that. Okay. The problem is nuclear energy has never come in at less than twice the projected cost, right? So instead of being 14 cents, it's 28 cents. And then you have to ask yourself, well, listen, we've got Quebec hydro. Do we really need, right? And if that's 7 cents or 8 cents, right? Do we really need a small amount even at 14 cents? Okay. So now this is what I read in the newspaper. The private developers are assuming all the risk on cost overrun, right? So if that's the guaranteed price to the electricity system, and if they have to pay the cost overrun, then okay. Except that if it goes over cost, then they're going to have to cut corners, and then I'd worry about safety. So I still have a lot of misgivings.
I think we're almost out of time. In fact, we are out of time, but I'm going to sneak in one last question. It is the last question on the list, and I think it's an interesting one. Do you think that changes in agricultural practices, forestry management, and better conservation and land use are making a significant difference in terms of climate change?
Okay, so it's interesting you ask that because I'm actually doing some work now on the climate and land use benefits of hypothetical as a sort of an upper limiting case. What if all Canadians were vegan? I myself am vegan, and I'm convinced that from a health point of view, that's the best possible choice. But I'm looking at it now from a land requirement point of view and a greenhouse gas emission point of view. And I mean, it's quite clear, just like we don't have the metals to support our high energy lifestyle if we're going to try to do it all on renewable energy. We're not going to meet our climate targets with anything close to the current North American levels of beef and dairy consumption. So at the very least, we're going to have to see a shift towards lower levels of meat consumption. And that would definitely confer significant healthcare benefits, not to mention quality of life benefits, as long as it's a high quality plant-based diet and not a junk food plant-based diet. Okay. So, because if you look at what can be done, you can reduce the per unit, the emissions per unit of beef produced or per unit of milk produced, but we're talking, 20 to 30% reductions when we need 80% reductions, right? So, yeah, so this is the other issue then, is promoting a healthier more plant-based diet, which confers all sorts of environmental benefits in addition to reduced warming of the climate.
I'd like to take this opportunity then to thank you very much, Danny, for a very optimistic presentation. I had some questions, but I didn't ask them because they were not optimistic. But thank you very much for speaking with us, and I really appreciate you coming and speaking.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure, and we can continue chatting if you want after the session is over.
So I guess we're finished for now, and if people want to hang on, you're welcome to. But